Hi everybody, I'm Tom Wild from ProWritingAid. Thank you for joining us for another session in the Ask a Book Doctor series from ProWritingAid. My guest as always for these sessions is our resident book doctor, Sally OJ. How are you doing, Sally?
I'm doing absolutely great, Tom. It's a lovely evening and I can't wait. I so look forward to these sessions, especially to the questions. It's just great.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, it's a lovely evening here in the UK. We're actually getting a blast of summer for once. Lovely warm evening. Now, Sally, today we're talking subplots, and we strayed into subplots last month a little bit when we were tension and conflict. We're going to expand on some of that tonight, getting to some more details. Let's start with the obvious one. Maybe just define what a subplot is.
Well, I would love to. You know, I said last week when I did stray into subplots last month, I said, you know, I could talk about subplots forever. So there will be a little bit of overlap tonight, which I'm sure is not a problem. And I think one of the things I said last time is a subplot is in nearly every book, if you've got a subplot, it's the main plot is where all the action carries the story forward, where all the main story happens, where the important characters are established and all of that. It's the main highway that goes down the center of your story. If you've got a subplot, you're adding extra layers of possibility to the story. You're adding more backstory, you're adding more detail and more texture. You're adding the possibility of extra tension. You're just giving more richness to the main arc. And this is all stuff that I have got notes here, and this is all stuff that I might have said last time, but I really don't think it matters, because the more you reiterate it, the better it is. So you're giving this extra bit of spice to the story. So if you've got the main story and things are happening, but you've got a subplot over here where other things are happening, you're reading the subplot and you're thinking, oh, you know, how's this going to affect the main story? Do they realize that this has happened? This is terrible. You know, if this plays out, it's all going to go wrong. So you've immediately got this lovely sort of counterpoint going on between the two, and they sort of bump into each other and go away from each other. So as well as supporting the central theme, which it should do, the subplot very importantly also adds variety. So you can cut away to a different setting, a different group of people, sometimes even, of course, a different time. And this all helps to keep the plot engaging in a very vital way. So if the main story is, especially often in the middle of a book, you know, the central story can sometimes flag a little bit, the pacing can drop a little bit. If you can just cut away to, you know, the two people wiring up the bomb across town, you know, immediately the tension's back and everything's going great. So it helps keep things sort of barreling along. Yeah. Either with sort of literal complications or the suggestion of what might have been, you know, backstory, or the suggestion of what might be to come. So again, if you cut to these two people wiring the bomb, well, that's not going to end well, is it? So, you know, it just keeps it moving. Keeps things moving and supports the main plot is the simple answer. Is the simple answer to your question. Yeah. No, that's great. You didn't want a simple answer, did you?
Well, no, I did, because when we talked about this the other day, we were talking for a while before I thought, well, actually, maybe it's best to just start with a clear definition. I think, you know, there's a lot to say on it, but I think that covers it. I think, so one of the things that interests me is that you said, you know, it's worth reiterating from last one. I'm sure, I actually agree that I'm sure a lot of this is, I'd be interested to know from our listeners today, you know, what issues you've encountered with subplots. Have you used subplots effectively? Have you had any trouble? Have you felt that actually you're not getting it quite right? So if you have got questions about those things, put them in the Q&A panel. But Sal, from your perspective, when you have a new writer on board, a new client, a subplot, are they a common issue? Do most people, you know, do most people include them, and do most people get it right?
No, most people don't include them, and that's well, most people that put, but when I usually when I have to raise the issue of subplots, it's because it's missing and you've got a very linear plot. And it can be quite a sort of interesting linear plot, but when you boil it down, it's, you know, Dave woke up, he was unhappy, he met this girl, he couldn't find her again, he fought all the alligators, and then he found her. So that sounds quite exciting, but it actually just kind of goes in a straight line. It's very linear. And I quite often find this, somebody's put a lot of trouble into sort of packing what's necessary in many ways into the story, but there are no twists and turns. There's no, well, obviously fighting alligators could be construed as a twist or a turn, but it's basically sort of very one note. It all goes in the same direction. And when that happens, or when there's problems with pacing, which is much more usually to the point, or when there's problems with tension, which we spoke about last week, then I say, come on, let's see where we can find a subplot. And, you know, there's always somewhere in the plot that you can find one. What about this character? What about this thing? We can make something out of this. And what I do really like is finding a character that doesn't seem very important. You know, they've just been into the shop and they've bumped into Mrs. Brown and had a quick chat and gone again. And she's told them perhaps something important, but actually it turns out that Mrs. Brown is much more important to the story than we thought. You know, this is the kind of thing that can be, it's a great place for reveals, a subplot.
I'm smiling because I can remember kind of books that I've read where actually you get quite, the subplot becomes a bit you really look forward to. You know, you want the updates, you want to see what's happening there as much in the same plot. So
this is the problem that I have most, is that I'm encouraging people to put a subplot in.
Okay.
There are different problems that arise when there is, I mean, of course, not always. Some people, loads of people do it brilliantly, but the inclusion of a subplot can raise its own issues.
Okay. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, the main thing is trying to cram too much, using them as sort of information dumps. Or really sort of bald-faced exposition. So just you cut away to two characters who are just telling each other stuff so that the reader can get the stuff. And in theory, that can work very well, but it's got to be done with panache. You know, you can't just have this sort of big information dump. So if you're using it as a vehicle to get information across, which is one of the main good things about a subplot, it's got to be done with a light touch.
Right.
I say light touch, I mean, two people wiring a bomb isn't exactly a light touch, but you've got to put the same care and time into the subplot as you do into the main plot, and that's something that some people sometimes forget.
Okay.
It needs as much careful planning and plotting out as your main story does.
It's interesting that you mentioned story dump, because I've noticed, I think Liz commented in chat that she had been told that she did a backstory dump. So, you know, it's obviously a common thing. So, okay, so it's not just the fact that subplots can often be missing, but actually getting the subplot right is a real challenge. So what advice do you offer, Sal? When you have somebody you're working with like that, how do you... I don't know, what are the kinds of subplot? How can, what would you tell them to focus on?
So we touched on this a little bit last time, but I did rather rattle through it, I think. So if we sort of go back a bit to basics, a subplot is, think of it as, well, it's also known as a secondary plot. So it's this second story arc, which supplements and supports and enhances the central one. I know it seems like I just said that. I'm kind of saying it again. So what you're looking to do is you want to bring out the themes and the settings of the main plot and help develop the main plot and develop the main characters if you can. So there are different subplot possibilities. So like I said, the main plot is where all the action that carries the story forward happens. So what you're looking for is a bit you know, we're back to condiments again. For those of you who've been with us for a long time, it's just a bit of sort of sauce on the side of your story that really brings the taste out. So there are various different kinds of subplot, and of course you can do absolutely anything you want, and that can be a subplot. And the most common ones are going back in time, you know, to explain how we got to where we are. That's probably the most usual kind of subplot, but there's all sorts of different ones, and there are to get a bit jargony. I don't like jargon, as you know. I don't like dragging things down to jargon, but so you can have an explanatory subplot or an expository subplot, which is a counter story, a backstory, which we were just talking about, explaining, you know, where we are now, shining a light on the cause and the effect behind what's happening in the main plot. Okay. Or it can be happening in a different place, or even a different, as I said, a different time. But it illustrates an element of the story which explains how things are subsequently playing out in the main story. So there's 100 different possibilities you could go with it, with an explanatory subplot. Then you can have another very common one is a romantic subplot. And so that means as the main story is going on, you know, think of every Hollywood film, you know, think of Indiana Jones. You know, there's usually a girl lurking somewhere in the background waiting to get kissed at the end of the film, you know. So, but hopefully with a little bit more vavavoom than that. So a romantic subplot, if it's happening between two main protagonists, it will be very much the main plot. But if there's a bit of will they, won't they, if there's a bit of, you know, background to it, if we know they went to school together but then fell out, and then, you know, this kind of thing, if there's it can bring new tension to the romance, it can bring new interest and bring new depth and interest to it, insight to it, and that's very can be a very good thing, a romantic subplot. And then you've got what they call, you know, secondary conflict. I really don't like all this jargon. I try not to use it, but but secondary conflict is, you know, say you've got the main story is George has decided to go off to Borneo to hunt weasel's eggs, and this is the story, and it's very exciting. But secondary conflict is usually, or very often, it's what they call person against self. So, you know, while we discover why he's gone off to Borneo, it's because he's got some kind of internal angst that he's trying to work out, and conflict with himself, basically. Okay. That's a very common sort of secondary subplot, is conflict. So bringing out, again, I mean, you could say it's explanatory, but it brings out a different side to the main character, or a different side to one of the characters. And it can be, I mean, the instant thing I can think of is a book by Jean-Paul Sartre. There's a trilogy by Jean-Paul Sartre called The Iron in the Soul. And there's a character, well, all of his characters, you get to learn a lot about the interior world, but there's a character of his who's very smooth on the outside, but he's absolutely tortured on the inside. And you get to see this through weird things, because it's Sartre. Like he loves his cats, and he puts all his cats in a basket and he takes them to the river, but he can't go through with it, as a way of sort of punishing himself for being who he is. But then he comes home and he feels even worse because he didn't manage to do the thing that he was going to do, but he loves his cat. Now that's a very extreme example, and I've got no idea why I thought of that example, perhaps because it is so extreme. But it's a clever way of showing us how tortured he is.
Yes.
And it's also a clever way of contrasting. You know, the last time we saw him, he was very smooth. He was talking to his friends. He was happy. And then the next time you see him, he's putting these cats who he loves in a basket and taking them to the river. He doesn't go through with it, everybody. It's okay. So those are the most common types of subplot.
I love.
Of course,
so
it must. Well, just saying that a subplot must dovetail. It must dovetail at some point with the main storyline. You know, you can't. Otherwise, you've just got basically two books running next to each other, and that can work, but doesn't very often work.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say, I love your examples. I love the books, the books you kind of quote, but also the examples you think of on the spot. Hunting for Weasel's Eggs was not one I'm familiar with, but what a story!
Somebody out there write it.
Yeah. Okay. Are we okay to go to a couple of questions, because they're mounting up, and it'd be good to get started on a few of those, Sal.
I hope, Tom, I'm very happy to go to questions. I hope, you know, what we wanted to do today, you and I, was sort of enhance a little bit what we talked about last time. So hopefully, you know, with the questions, we can sort of dig a bit deeper into rather than just reiterate what I said last time.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Well, let's see. We've got plenty of time yet. So, I mean, there are a lot of people that are asking, you know, is there an ideal number of subplots in a novel? So let's start with that.
There isn't an idea, and you know me, you know I always say rules are made to be broken. But I remember last time somebody asked a question and they had 6 subplots in their book, and I just found that very difficult to picture. Now, for all I know, and I said to him at the time, he might have really pulled it off. No. 1 is good. 2, if you can pull off 2, is good. I really, what's the other thing I always say? Think of your reader. So if you start mashing up the plot too much, if you start really sort of putting too much in there, the reader's got to follow this, the reader's got to keep them all separate, the reader's got to know what's going on. Now, if you can pull off 3, if you can pull off 4, and keep it clear and be certain that the reader will be able to keep up. You know, a lot of crime novels will have usually not more than 3, actually, honestly, if I think about it. Someone's going to be out there who's going to know a crime book that's got 12, you know, but well,
there's an interesting kind of link here probably to a couple of the next questions, which is around the kind of series subplots. So Sandra asks, I think for me, the hardest subplot is a series subplot that goes over a few books and creates a backstory for the main plot in each book. Any suggestions how to make sure it's not missing anything? And there's a couple of questions like that.
So if you're writing a trilogy, say you're writing a trilogy, I always give, now, not everyone likes to do this and not everyone agrees with my advice, but I say even if you're writing one book, have a plot plan. You can always change things. It's not carved in stone. You know, this is not, anything can change, but begin your book with a plot plan. So have an idea of what the story arc is going to be, have an idea of what the main points in the story are going to be, and have an idea what the sort of main revelation points for the character is going to be, because you want your character to grow over the course of the book, for things to change and the character to grow. So, you know, this is where this happens, this is where this happens, this is where this happens. It can change, and it inevitably will change. I'm coming to the question, I promise. So what you want if you've got a trilogy, if you want to keep your reader on board, is first of all, you need to plan the story arc of the trilogy, and then you have to plan the story arc of your 3 books within that larger story arc. And then if you've got a subplot that carries them through, you've got to plan that story arc as well. So the simple answer to your question is planning. And remember, some people love it, but some people are terribly reluctant to do this. It makes them feel claustrophobic, it makes them feel pinned down. I know I'm repeating myself. You can change anything. It doesn't matter. You can change it all, but have an idea when you start. So if you want your subplot to play out and to work, you've first of all got to have a sense of what it's playing against. So you've got to be very clear about your main story. And then you've got to be very clear about what you want your subplot to deliver to the reader. Always think of your reader. Have I mentioned that? You've got to be very clear about what you want your subplot to deliver, what you want your subplot to reveal. and what your subplot is going to give to the main plot to help it and support it. And so that is, I would suggest, the way to do it.
I love that point you're illustrating about plot plans. You know, they're a tool to use, but don't, you know, not something to beat yourself with. They're not.
Absolutely not. Yeah. It's just, and, you know, people do it in all sorts of different ways. You know, there is the Post-it note method, and I mean, I know people who use spreadsheets, which baffles me, but it works for them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we had some interesting sessions on this, I think, back in Crime Week.
So, with a crime book, you've really got to do it.
Ian Rankin was talking about this. I can't remember what he said exactly, but it was very interesting. So some people are saying, asking about kind of subplots being resolved. Do they have to be resolved entirely? Can you leave them open? You know, particularly if you're thinking of leaving the door open for a series or for a, you know.
So when you write a series, this is absolutely vital. And think of yourself and the series that you read. Each book must work as a standalone. It's really important. You can't just leave things open because of book 2, because somebody might read book 2 first and then read book, you know, each book has got to work absolutely solidly as a standalone. Of course, you can seed things in book 1 that's not going to play out until book 4. I mean, look at J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
You know, she's one of the many masters of that art. But what she doesn't leave is anything dangling. At the end of each book, the book is finished. All the subplots are apparently resolved. Apparently resolved is the word I use. So what can happen is in book 2, chapter 4, oh my God, it wasn't resolved at all. He wasn't dead. You know, it wasn't real gold. He's not his father, you know. So these are the things. So that's the joy of going on to his second book. But yes, for my mind, the trouble is that I have a strong aversion to ambiguous endings, and I know some people love them, and we've talked about this before. But I feel that the majority of people do not like ambiguous endings. I think the majority of people like to at least think that they know what has happened and feel some kind of closure. They don't want to finish a book and say, what the hell was that all about? And you don't really want your reader to think that, I think, do you? So I urge towards giving a subplot at least the illusion of closure.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Love that. A question just caught my eye, because I think this probably sums up something rather nicely. So Alice says, you mentioned backstory. My beta readers felt they needed more of why my character does something and what happened to her. Can the backstory be a subplot? Okay, I evaded writing backstory, so I'm thinking I need it. I know what happened, my reader didn't. And that's the thing, isn't it? If you can get caught up in your head, you know what happened, but actually... This
is a huge problem. And I'm going to take a quick moment to say it's beta reader. Think of alpha, beta, the Greek alphabet.
I know, but we have a...
I've only quite recently learned that myself. I used to be confused.
But we have a large US audience, so for that...
okay, I do apologise so much for my cleverness. That'll learn me. And now you're going to have to remind me the question, and I'm so sorry to the person who asked the question.
So it was
a good question.
The fact that part of the thing about a backstory is that or subplot is that it's easy to be involved in your book and your story, and in your head, you know what's happened to that character, you know where the characters come from, you know what that backstory is. But
yes, I remember. So this can be an absolutely huge problem, getting the story out of your head and onto the page, because this is something I talk to authors about all the time. And if there's anyone that I've worked with here, they're going to be saying, oh, she's talking about this again. So get what you've got, what's been cooking in your head for possibly years and is crystal clear to you, has got to come out on the page as crystal clear for the reader. And I think as some people like to, just don't make things hard for your reader. Just make things as easy for your reader as they just want to. I've used this phrase before. I coined it and I was so proud of myself. They just want to glide down the river of your story, you know, trailing their hands in the water. They don't want to cling to the sides of the boat. You know, they just want to have fun. And that can be, you know, exciting fun. So yes, it's no good you knowing what happened if the reader doesn't, because they're just going to be puzzled. That's going to be edging towards what is, again, I just can't stop with the jargon tonight, but that's going to be edging towards what's called deus ex machina, which is, yeah, I know it means a god in the machine, but what it actually means is, Agatha Christie did it a lot, is where something, you know, the denouement is their uncle from Guatemala who you've never heard of before, and it turns out that he did it with a monkey in the scullery. I don't mean that. That sounds worse than I mean. Killed somebody with a monkey in the scullery is obviously what I was saying. So, and there's no way you could have known that. There's no way you could have known about the uncle from Guatemala until the reveal. That's deus ex machina. So you have to be very careful. Not if you've got it in your head, but you haven't given the reader any information or any clues in your subplot, then they're just going to go, well, where the hell did that come from? I didn't know that was going on. And they'll feel cross with you, and you don't want your reader to feel cross with you.
No. Okay. Interesting. One of the most common questions we're being asked is around when to introduce a subplot. So is it possible to introduce subplot too soon or too late in a book? Was one of the questions. In other words,
that does come down to plotting. It is impossible to introduce it too late, I would say. If you suddenly drop, I've had this before, where somebody's suddenly dropped a different point of view or a different time in sort of at the halfway mark, and for me that's too late.
Right.
Again, I'm sure chat is going to start bristling with examples of books that have done it perfectly, but you've got to think of your reader, because what your reader's going to think is, oh, now I have to know, you know, I've got this whole book worked out now, I'm halfway through, and then suddenly the uncle from Guatemala turns up with the monkey and it's all bad. So I would say usually a good place is 3 or 4 chapters in, but that's so general. I mean, you know, that's a really big generalization. And sometimes books start, you know, a lot of crime, and we're back to Elizabeth George now, who I always talk about. A lot of crime thrillers will start with the subplot. That's not uncommon. And then switch to the main story. But you've really got to know what you're doing to carry that off. You've really got to have absolute mastery of your story to carry that off. So there's no hard and fast rule. But if you drop it in too late, I suppose that can work as a real reveal when things are sort of going soggy. I suppose that can work, but I've only seen it as being problematic. But once again, people here might think, I can think of lots of books where that happens. You know what they say, good writing is invisible. So, you know. Yeah.
Well, someone actually asked whether you could have a hint near the beginning and come back with stronger conflicts later in the book. So I guess you'd introduce a subplot.
Absolutely, you can do that. And that's, you know, seeding stuff is always good, if it's done well and not heavy-handedly. It's, you know, seeding. You know, what's great is to get to the end of the book and to get to the reveal and think, yes, you know, they mentioned that. Yes. That was there on page 120, and, you know.
Well, you feel satisfied bringing it all together, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's just clear one thing up, because a couple of people asked this around the difference between backstory and subplot and whether they're the same thing.
It depends. If you're giving the backstory in the main plot, so if you've got your characters avoiding exposition, of course, but you know, you've got your gumshoe in his office, the sexy broad with the black dress comes in and, you know, gives him the backstory to why she's there.
Yeah.
You know, that's part of the main plot. It's still backstory, but it's backstory. If she comes in and says, my husband's disappeared, I don't know what's happened, there was just a note and a dead parrot on the floor, and then they carry on and they start looking, and then we cross to the room with the dead parrot, and my God, the parrot wasn't dead at all, and it had swallowed the vital microfilm, and somebody crept into the room and collected the parrot and the microfilm. You know, that's a subplot, because then you're going down a different alley. So it's about what happens. You remember what I said at the beginning, the main story is like the main highway. So if things happen on the main highway, that's just backstory. If things happen on a country road running parallel, that's subplot.
Right. I shouldn't take a drink while you're coming up with one of your great stories.
It could happen.
Yes. Jim's asked an interesting question. He's asked whether we could talk a bit about convergent plots, where several characters on several paths eventually come together before or at the climax. So The Stand by Stephen King is one example. Are each of these characters traveling a subplot then?
Well, now we're veering into threads, aren't we? So I would call that different POVs and different threads.
Okay.
But without seeing the book, I wouldn't know. But and then you know, I love the term thread, because you know, you begin to plait them.
Yes.
To sort of plait them into one story, which is I like very much.
So what's just define POV for people who might not know?
A point of view, sorry.
Oh, POV. So
yeah.
I was confused for a second. Yes. Okay. Is there a difference between a subplot and a twist? Thinking like in a crime novel.
Yes, there is, absolutely. And again, it comes back to what's happening on the main highway. Now, of course, you can have a twist in a subplot. The subplot can be a great place for reveals. And this is, you know, it can be really good because the reader knows what's happening, but the protagonist doesn't, or, you know, but you can have huge twists in the main plot. And I give you Fingersmith as an example of that, you know. So you can use the subplot for twists and cliffhangers and reveals, all of those things, but they are also things that can happen in the main story.
Yeah. Actually, talking about using subplots, so someone says, what's the best use of subplots? To mirror the main plot or to provide a contrast? And just does it depend on what you're trying to accomplish? And well, you tell me, so.
Well, to go back to what I said, and I don't mean that rudely, you want to support the central theme, and you want to add variety, and you want, so if you've got a different setting or a different group of people, and you want to keep it helps to keep the plot engaging. Yeah. So and add a bit of spice, but it also does support the main story, and that's a really important point of a subplot, is to like the supporting cast in a film, you know, just to keep the main story vivid and interesting and full of possibility. If you cut to a subplot, that can help tremendously. Or just going back in time can do that, or forward in time. Let's not limit ourselves.
Ooh, yeah. Now, this is a conveniently asked question, because one thing the question is, what are the biggest mistakes or errors to avoid when writing in subplots? And I did wonder, I'm not sure that we've covered all of the mistakes and errors that you sometimes come across.
So the information dump is, lack of clarity is another huge thing. Always think of your reader. So I have seen this before, when you suddenly cut to, you know, the Kalahari Desert, and there's a robot and it's eating pomegranates, and you know, what the hell is going on? And then you think, okay, well, I'll just keep reading because it will become clear. But I have read subplots that do not appear to have any connection to the main story for way too long. It's not another, I mean, and there always is a connection eventually, but you've got to think of your reader. You've got to think of them. You don't want your reader to start thinking, well, when is this going to start making sense? This is, oh God, we're back to the desert and the pomegranates and the robot. You know what? I just want to read about, you know, if Susan's going to get the guy. I'm not, what's going on, you know? So that is a mistake, or just really overcomplicating. And I've seen this in one of the reasons I you know, at the very beginning of my career, I thought I can do sci-fi, and I can't, turns out. But I've seen this especially in sci-fi books, that they cram all this information that is not only new information, but really new information, you know, about inventions or galaxies or you know, androids. So it's not just new, but it's new to be all crammed into the subplot. And it's just really hard. It's very clear, as the other person said, very clear in the writer's head, but you've got to make sure that things are clear for your readers. So that's a danger. And the other danger is just underusing them, so that you've basically got one sort of not very pacey main story being complemented by a not very pacey subplot, and then they're both just kind of going along. So if you're going to have a subplot, use it. You know, use it to your advantage.
I love this question. Is a subplot appropriate in a picture book?
I can plead the fifth with this one, because I can't do, well, I'm assuming you might mean children's, which I'm the person who would have said, Mr. Men are rubbish. This is never going to catch on. No one's going to like this.
Yes.
The drawings are good, but the stories are rubbish. So I can't do children's at all. Same with I'm going on a bear hunt. I would have said, no child is going to like this. Ha! So if you mean in a graphic novel, then absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows? But interesting one. Any thoughts out there would be good. Cal Writer 2 asks, my developmental editor had me remove my subplot, which caused trouble for the protagonists in a contemporary romance because it added unnecessary characters and drew attention away from the main characters. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I should have actually, you know, shame on me, because that if you stuff a subplot to the gills with not just some new characters, but a whole sort of new cast of characters, that is going to be very confusing for the reader, and it will take away from the main story. The skill of writing a subplot is to enhance the main story, not draw away from. So I assume this editor knew what they were doing, and that's what was happening. And yes, that's a very good point.
Interesting. Okay, that's great to know. Can you bring your main plot and subplot together partway through the story? I'm assuming, yeah.
You can, but then the sort of excitement, I mean, of course you can, but then the excitement added by the subplot is kind of gone. Yeah. So, I mean, what you can do is bring them together and then pull them apart again. But again, that's quite skilled stuff. And I'm not at all suggesting that people here aren't skilled writers, but that is, you know, high level plotting to do that and to carry it off well. I wouldn't advise just merging them in the middle of the book, because that again, that's really just bringing two threads together rather than having a subplot.
That's probably somewhat related to this question. It's quite a detailed one, quite interesting though. So forgive me, I can't pronounce the name. Ihnizdo. My family saga about part Czech Jewish, part Afro-Caribbean family is being published in September. Of course, there are lots of subplots with various stories of relatives. I worry people might get confused about all those characters. I have a list, but still worry some of these subplots are important. The main story is a mother Holocaust survivor and her daughter having a troublesome relationship.
Well, first of all, if it's being published, I mean, is it being self-published, or have you found a publisher?
We'll find out.
If it's, I don't mean to sound facile, but if it's being published, it's a bit late. But on the other hand, you're aware of the possible issue, which is more than half the battle won.
Yeah.
I think with big family sagas, you've just got to give each character and each situation enough room to breathe. And this is terribly important. So the reader can get familiar with this family and these people and understand them and understand the motivation and understand why they're there in the story. And then we cut to this family in this situation and the same. Give them all enough room to breathe. This is what's terribly important, because if you're just going like this, it's just going to become a lot of names very, very quickly, and names that the reader's not going to remember. So as long as you give each set of characters enough room to breathe, enough room to become really embedded in the story for the reader and familiar to the reader, so when they read the name again, they'll know who that is, then it can work. I mean, you know, again, look at I say this, most people here are going to be too young to remember when this was a television sensation, but look at the Forsyte Saga. You know, that was a book written in the 19th century, I think, but it was a huge hit on television in the 1960s, worldwide sensation. And that's a family saga that goes, I think, 4 or 5 generations, and yeah. You know, but it's done very well. You get to know each character, you get to know each situation, and before you move on to the next one.
So thanks for that, Sal. I've got a question around, I think this is probably linked to plot planning. Chris asks, does it make sense to make first rough draft be all plot and then add subplots in rewrites? Is that a way you could approach that?
I would say no, but it really works for some people. You know, what I always say, I say chuck everything into the first draft. Absolutely everything, get it all down, because it's just the first draft. And it's a good way of seeing if the subplot works. It's a good way of seeing if it's so. But other people, if they've got a clear idea of what the subplot is going to be, I have known this, but in the one time that it's happened, I've said without knowing that it had happened, I said, this looks like it's sort of tacked on as an afterthought. And he said, oh, I did write it after I finished the book, you know, I did add it. No, it wasn't an afterthought. He had it thought out very carefully. But the thing is, you've got to then really bed it down into the waft and weave of the book you've already got. And that can be problematic. If you can pull that off, there's no reason it shouldn't work. I would suggest, I mean, some people write them separately, the two separately, which I guess what you're saying, and then weave them together, but that's still part of the first draft. So the simple truth is you've just got to find what works for you.
Yeah.
You've just got to find what works for you. But if you add anything afterwards, it's got to, and this comes the same like adding characters, adding other plot twists and stuff, it's got to fit into the weave of the story. It can't just sit on top of it. And that can be a problem.
I've just made a note of the term waft and weave. I've not come across it before, but I think it's brilliant. You're going to tell me it's to do with thatching in Sussex or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So time is marching on. We have gone through more than 20 questions and there are still more to answer. But before we do that, are there any things that you wanted to touch on or bring up that we haven't covered yet before we just, before we end with a few last questions?
I know I am thinking.
We can tell.
I think one thing perhaps that we haven't talked about is motivation.
Okay.
So a subplot is a very good way of showing what's making your protagonist act the way she's acting or not acting, or so. I mean, in a way, that's part of what we've been talking about, isn't it? But motivation is always important. Understanding the reader, understanding why a character's doing something is always important. And it's quite nice to think of your reader sort of at chapter 7 going, Oh, okay. Oh, I get it now. So that's, that's quite a nice thing to have. Apart from that, I mean, in a general sense, I think we've pretty much covered all the important bases, but that's why I like the questions, because all sorts of other things come up in the questions.
Well, I've got a good one for you. So Prudence.
I regret it.
Prudence asks whether subplots can be used for foreshadowing. And
absolutely. And I mean, this is what I said about keeping the tension up and everything. So it's great if your reader knows something that the protagonist doesn't know. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
So that's one of the main things that if it's done well, it works brilliantly in a subplot. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Let's see, there's a couple more. So Michael asks, story arc brackets plot and character arc. Is the character arc a subplot?
No. The character arc is the journey that the character goes on through the book. What you don't want is Bilbo to be the same hobbit that he was at the beginning of the story.
Yes.
By the end of the story. You don't want Harry Potter to be the same bloke that was living under the stairs at the end of the story. So that's what a character arc is. It's the journey that the character goes on.
Yeah.
And it can be certainly integrated into a subplot. The subplot can be used to explain the character arc, but it's not a subplot. No, it should be part of the waft and weave of the main story.
Great. And besides looking at other characters for possible subplots, where else can we look for subplots?
Well, I love doing this actually with an author, but it does depend on the. So, okay. My favorite, as I said, is that you've got a character who appears to be completely innocuous. 1984, the guy who owns the shop that they get the room above. He starts as this, he's just Mr. What's his name, and he smiles at them as they come in, and it turns out he's one of the biggest baddies in the book. But it doesn't have to be a baddie, it could be, innocuous Auntie Nellie might have been in the resistance during the war and might have the secret to the whole story, or might be able to work things out better than any of the rest of you can. These are the kind of things. So looking at sort of characters that don't have much light shone on them, that's a good way of doing it. But in the same way, when they went into the shop to get that Mars bar, that could actually have been where, the subplot bumped into the main plot and veered off again. So it's finding points in the story. It's finding sort of touchstones in the story, or characters or moments that you think, and really it's just got to be you. Though brainstorming is always a great idea. And one of the good things about brainstorming is somebody will say, I think it should be that moment when they got the Mars bar. And you, the author, will say, no, that's not it. But you saying that has just made me realise when they leave the shop and the bloke in the red car goes past, that's the place. So brainstorming is really good just for sort of stimulation.
Okay.
Talking it through. Of course, the trouble is finding, as you will all know, and my heart goes out to every single one of you, finding somebody who's willing to talk to you about your book in depth is very hard, at least for a sustained period of time. But if you can get, I mean, that's why writing groups tend to be quite good, if you are that way inclined, and not everybody is. But a supportive writing group is a wonderful place, but so yes, it's looking carefully at your book and looking carefully at things that happen and think, yeah, this could be something. This I could turn that into something.
Okay. So,
and it comes back. Sorry, just one. I've talked before about part of being a writer. Part of being a writer is pushing yourself, thinking of different possibilities, thinking of. It's not just getting the story down, it's getting the story down and then pushing yourself that bit further, stretching your creativity, testing yourself as a writer. That's the next stage that everyone has to aim for. So then that's a good place to start doing that.
Great. So I felt I like your motivational bit there. Right, we need to bring this to a close, unfortunately, and I do apologise because there have been a few questions we haven't managed to get to. I just want to make a quick point because this is our 12th in the series. We would love to carry on doing this, but we rely on ideas, and we'd love to know what subjects you, our audience, would like us to cover. That might be things you would like us to repeat. That might be new subjects that Sally can offer some insight on. So if you add those to chat right now, and then I'll make sure that we are, I catalogue all of those and we go through them and draw up the future kind of list, as it were. Now,
Tom, sorry, I don't mean to make you lose your thread, but I even thought we could just do some Q&As. If people have got questions, I'd be very happy to do that.
Great. Yeah, brilliant idea, actually. So, and I love this. Someone in chat, and it's 6219 Aston. So sorry, but that's your email address. Has just said, completely agree. I had that experience today with a long-suffering son who's into script writing. He helped me have an aha moment. So there we go. That's your kind of brainstorming, isn't it? Brilliant. And thank you for the ideas that are coming in. Good dialogue, theme, anti-heroes.
We've done some of these, of course, but we can happily do them again.
Okay, and I also want to end with a lovely comment from Michelle, who has raised a point of order, as she says, or he. I'm not sure where you're from, Michelle. Michelle says, you weave a warp and a weft.
There you go.
There we go. I've learned something. Today. Right.
And next, what are we doing next time, Tom?
Next one, we are on, and Amelia is going to love this because we are talking about fan fiction. And Amelia has just asked, has just said she'd like to hear more about fan fiction and a general Q&A. So there we go. We'll be going into fan fiction.
Yes, it's something about something I feel very strongly about, actually, converting fan fiction, because I think a lot of good books get lost because it's not done properly. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Brilliant. Sally, so many thank yous as usual. Really appreciate your time. Lots of lovely messages in chat. And so a big thank you back to all of you who joined us tonight. We love these sessions. It's always great having the interaction. It's what makes it so special, as Sally said. So a big thank you from me. Sal, any closing comments?
Just a huge thank you to everyone. It really is the questions that make these sessions pop and fizz. It's brilliant. Thank you so much for being here. It's brilliant.
Okay. And with that, we'll bring it to an end. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month in August when we talk about fan fiction. Good night, everybody.
Night.